that curiosity is around really creating an environment now where people can ask questions, try things out, and feel safe to do so.
So I learned, I was on a trip with Josh Burson, who I know is on one of your podcasts. I know you've done work with Josh. And we took some chief learning officers to the University of Southern California. And one of the professors that we met there told us that the failure rate of drug projects is about 5,000 to 1. So for every 5,000 sort of drug trials that are kicked off, there's only one ends up as a sort of product in market, sort of doing the work that it's supposed to do. Yes. And I this failure seems to be baked into deeply into the system. And I wondered what kind of things you'd done to sort of to leverage that, to reawaken this culture where it's okay to fail as long as you learn from failure, or it's okay to not know something.
Yeah, so it is ironic that as an industry, failure is a part that is very much part of the industry. And you can even have situations where 10 years and $1 billion, and ultimately you end up with a product that still doesn't go to market at the end of it. So it is a key part of the industry, but that still doesn't change that. We were still not so tolerant of failure in the past. I think some of the things that we've done is certainly recognizing that part of curiosity is experimentation, and part of experimentation is by necessity failure. I think calling out where we have had things, and maybe it's not failure, maybe even failure is the wrong word, but it's discovering things that didn't work. So in taking a molecule through to market, actually, what is talked about as a failure is actually coming to the realization that it doesn't do the thing that you want it to do. And you can look at that as actually successful science that has realized that actually it wasn't the molecule to do what we needed it to do.
One of our earlier calls, you'd mentioned that you set goals, like you said 1 million hours of process learning. What to you is the value of giving people a sort of learning target in terms of time? How's that worked for you?
Yeah, so I mean, if we go back 2 years, so 2018, according to our systems, we did 22.6 hours of learning on average across our associates. So low by a lot of the benchmarks, and on trying to understand why. I mean, a lot of that was compliance and operating procedure type training. So part of it was not necessarily having access to great learning resources, but a big part was also a perception that time spent learning was maybe not time spent working, and that people were too busy to be spending time learning. I translate that as too busy means I've prioritized it too far down the to-do list that other things are deemed more important, and also feedback that my manager doesn't support me in learning. So we were looking at how do we change that mindset. And what we did was we had agreement with our executive committee that they would support an aspiration of people spending 5% of their time or 100 hours a year on learning, which was a far cry from the 22.6 that we did at that point. Why we did that was not about 100 hours being any sort of magic scientific number, but it was more around a symbol to say that the company values learning and the company wants you to invest time in building your skills, and in investing in yourself to be able to learn and be curious. And by talking about an aspiration, and I'm careful in the words I choose, that it's not a target, it is an aspiration, that people feel they can spend that time. And then that we track against that time, and not in a, that this will hinder your performance or anything like that, but we're just genuinely curious around who is able to spend the time and who isn't, and then we can and not on an individual level, but at a country or a divisional level, and that then allows us to understand what are the barriers to people not being able to spend the time. Is it that they don't know where to go to get access to the learning? Is it that their environment doesn't support? So maybe they're in a manufacturing environment, they don't have a laptop, they don't have a company device, and they can't physically physically access a lot of the resources that are available. And by looking at that time, we can see that as a leading indicator ultimately to the effectiveness. And learning hours is not an effectiveness metric, but learning hours is an indicative metric of whether people are spending the time learning, and if they're spending the time learning using great learning resources on things that are strategically important for the company, that should follow through that you're building the right skills. So it's one of many metrics, but it's a very helpful leading indicator, because if people aren't spending the time, then you're unlikely that you're building the skills at all. So what we saw in 2019 was an increase of over 50% up to about 36 hours. So it started to have an effect, but there's many other ways we need to measure as well.
Yeah, I mean, it basically makes a very sort of bold statement that's easy for people and line managers to sort of get their head around, and for senior managers to sort of reinforce. I get that.
Exactly.
How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted work?
Yeah, I mean, overall across the company, I mean, we're revisiting all of our molecules to see if any of them would have an impact against the COVID virus. So that's one aspect. I think at a more practical level, I mean, over the course of essentially a weekend, we had 60,000 people move to virtual working. So that has a huge impact. Our sales force in many parts of the world were not able to go into hospitals and doctors' surgeries and were based from home. So suddenly you've got large numbers of people that are not doing what they would normally be spending their time doing. On the manufacturing side, it became even more crucial that we continue our manufacturing, because we have many life-saving medications, and we need to make sure that those continue to be produced and then continue to be distributed to patients that need them wherever they are in the world. So on our sort of research and clinical trial side, we needed to make sure that those continued, so we didn't lose potentially many years worth of trials that were ongoing, and for our associates to try to keep that going. So it's significant impact and very different in different parts of the business as to whether suddenly you found that you were at home and the doctors you would normally see weren't available, or you found that actually your days got so much more hectic because you needed to find out how to get the medication to patients that needed it on a key trial that was ongoing. So yeah, very, very different depending on where you were in the business.
And I think of research labs, and I'm sure a lot of this work happens in, can't be pushed out to people's homes. It has to happen in a physical place. So presumably you have to worry about that too.
Yeah, so in the labs, it was what can continue, and how do we keep experiments that are happening in the labs ongoing with potentially less people and with social distancing and other pieces wherever possible. A lot of the work that we do can be done from home, but yeah, certainly the labs, the manufacturing, those need people on premise.
A lot of L&D teams that I'm talking to right now, I would sort of characterize a little bit as starting to sort of rethink their role. There's a couple of things that strike me. One is a lot of progressive L&D teams were real advocates for digital learning, and that's been a big push, I think probably maybe for the last 10 or more years for some of us. And yet when this thing strikes and everybody's entire workplace is digital, it seems there's still a lot of work for us to do to figure out, how to make that digital learning sort of really great. So there seems to be a lot of focus on that. And then there's a lot of focus on topics like helping people be successful as remote leaders and think about mindfulness and topics like that. How has this affected your teams, and sort of what are you doing to keep, I guess, to think about the sort of future role of L&D in a workplace that's very digital and distributed and remote?
Yeah, so maybe if I start with our response and then go on to sort of the future. So the initial response, I mean, we were fortunate in that as part of our what we call going big on learning, we'd invested in digital learning through things like Coursera and LinkedIn Learning for the whole company. So we had some great resources there that when people did move to virtual working, we were able to then very quickly curate those and put together resources around how to use Microsoft Teams, how to work from home. And we saw in the data that those were being adopted. So the week after 60,000 people went to working virtually, the number one learning program was around how to use Microsoft Teams.
Right.
The week after that, the number one program was around how to manage your time when working from home. And then it very quickly moved on to things like resilience and so forth as well. So we definitely saw some of the trends that you were describing around mindfulness. How do you manage your time? How do you manage under stress? How do you manage virtual working? We were curating content and we were sharing that out. And we saw a phenomenal uptake of that. So if we look at something like LinkedIn Learning, I think in February we were looking at about 1,000 hours a week that were being undertaken. By March, that had increased to about 7,000 hours a week. So enormous uptick in terms of the use of some of the resources. We also saw that there was a way that learning could help beyond our immediate associates as well. So we took a decision to offer Coursera to friends and family members, as well as just Novartis associates who would also be in lockdown. So that went down very well, and we've had over 10,000 people take up that offer of accessing Coursera, and we've extended that now even to broader aspects of our learning portfolio for friends and family, including things like language learning.
Interesting. And then the future orientation for L&D?
Yeah, so I think then it's looking at the impact that this has on the business, and then how can we support in whatever that means. Is it the business moving through digital channels in more areas, and therefore what are the capabilities that we need to be building? Interestingly, something that we thought was going to be a big draw on the learning teams, which was the sort of transition back into the workplace, actually turned out not to be really a role for learning. That it was more a sort of communications and I guess performance support to some degree of go here, do that. So I think more it's the strategic element of what are going to be the changes on the business from this, which people are still figuring out, and then what are the skills and the capabilities that may be different to today that we're going to need, and then how can learning teams really support to build out those key capabilities.
Simon, I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the book. Since you and I talked a couple of weeks ago, I didn't get my hands on the book yet, unfortunately, but so I can't claim to have read it. But I did find your podcast series, yes, which I thought was awesome. And I particularly I listened to 2 or 3 episodes, and I really like how you take this notion of curiosity, which I think is your kind of the language you use to do this kind of learning culture work at Novartis. But then you had a couple of co-authors, and you really explored this idea of curiosity in a lot of depth. Tell me about how you, what compelled you to write the book and the process, and how you worked with your co-authors on that.
Yeah, so it was about a year and a bit ago, April 2019, in the space of a week, 2 people had said independently to me, it's like, you should write a book about what you're doing at Novartis. I was like, curious. Okay, 2 people saying that completely unprovoked. Maybe I need to give this some thought. And was having dinner with Paul and Garrick, who are the co-authors, and they'd written a book around digital aspects before, and was picking their brain around, what was it like to write a book? How did you do it? What was involved? And they said, how about we co-author it with you? And it's like, nice. Okay, yeah, fantastic. And there was a much greater chance of it getting written and completed if it was a collaborative effort than if I was trying to do it purely on my own and juggling it with everything else. So from summer last year, sort of lying by the pool on summer holiday, was sort of fleshing out what might the structure look like in the chapters, and then we collectively sort of work through putting flesh into each of the chapters. We look at curiosity for the individual, curiosity for the business or organization, and then sort of curiosity for society. And then we've come up with a model that we call the 7 C's of curiosity, around sort of how you can be curious. And then we look at a sort of curious learner, a curious leader, and how do you create a culture around curiosity. And it weaves the Novartis story in there, but it also, and this is the joy of having diversity across us as authors, it brings in history and music and all sorts of other aspects from Garrick and Paul's own experience that is much richer than if I had done it all by myself. So.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things I loved about the podcast series is the sort of eclectic nature of it. So there's an episode with Josh, and he's talking about things that I'm very familiar with. And then you have an episode with, I think, Jackie Brassi from McKinsey, who's talking about, how you personally get in the sort of get the headspace and the attitude and overcome fear to really let curiosity kind of out. And then this extraordinary episode on the Warburg Institute with, is it Bill Sherman, I think?
Yes. Yep.
I mean, which sort of dives into a word that we in L&D have thrown about a lot over the last 10 years, which is curation, which I guess etymologically